Welcome to the Workplace Minute, powered by H3HR Advisors and sponsored by Paychex, one of the leading providers of HR, payroll, retirement, and software solutions for businesses of all sizes. My name is Steve Boese. The surprising results of California's minimum wage hike for fast food workers. The too long don't read version of today's Workplace Minute is this. California raised the minimum wage for fast food workers to $20 per hour, and despite what you may have heard or read, fast food employment kept rising in the state. Now let's dig into this interesting story in more detail. The employment effects of raising minimum wages for workers have long been debated and studied by economists, politicians, industry associations, labor unions, and trade groups, and often lead to widely different conclusions. Business groups and Republican politicians have argued for decades that minimum wage increases harm the very workers that they are supposed to help. And this one, passed in September 2023 and setting a salary floor of $20 an hour for fast food workers, appeared to be no different. However, economists began analyzing what actually happened when the minimum wage was raised and generally have reached the opposite conclusions. Since the early 1990s, economists have done dozens of studies of more than 500 minimum wage increases across the country. The bulk of the studies conducted in the last 30 years suggest the effect of minimum wages on jobs is quite modest, said Arindrajit Dubey, an economist at the University of Massachusetts, who has conducted multiple meta-analysis of the minimum wage literature. And sometimes they actually result in higher employment. The leading explanation is that when the minimum wage goes up, low-wage jobs suddenly become more attractive to workers who respond by staying in those jobs longer. Less turnover means that companies have to spend less time recruiting and training new hires, and that the workers themselves are more productive and less likely to make mistakes, all of which lowers an employer's labor costs. Businesses also typically absorb some of the costs via lower profit margins and pass some of the cost along to consumers in the form of higher prices. In September of 2023, California passed the law AB 1228 that would raise the hourly wages of fast food workers across the state from $16 an hour to $20 an hour, a far larger increase than any that had previously been studied. And this new law applies only to employees at chains having more than 60 locations nationwide. Almost immediately, the dire consequences on the fast food industry in California of such a dramatic increase in minimum wages were trumpeted in the media. Headlines such as, "California restaurants cut jobs as fast food wages set to rise" from the Wall Street Journal, and "California's minimum wage woes are a cautionary tale for the nation" in The Hill abounded. Conservative politicians took up the cause, championed by some, with dire warnings and scary pronouncements. During the presidential campaign, then-candidate Donald Trump, when asked whether or not he would support raising the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, was quoted as saying, "In California, they raised it up to a very high number, and your restaurants are going out of business all over the place. The population is shrinking, and it's had a very negative impact." Except Trump and the others were wrong. The minimum wage increase hasn't had that impact. In the 6 months after California's new minimum wage law came into effect in April, the state's fast food sector actually gained jobs and done so at a faster pace than much of the rest of the country. If anything, it proves that the minimum wage can be raised even higher than experts previously believed without hurting employment. That should be good news, but instead the policy has been portrayed as a catastrophic failure. And that is a testament to how quickly economic misinformation spreads and how hard it is to reverse it once it does. Shortly after the law passed, the state's fast food industry erupted in protest. Before the law took effect in April of 2024, the owners of hundreds of Pizza Hut locations declared that they would be forced to lay off all of their 1,200 delivery drivers. And the owner of 140 Burger King franchises claimed that he would have to slash worker hours and expedite the rollout of self-service kiosks. And Rubio's, a regional Mexican food chain, announced that it would close 48 stores, citing the rising cost of doing business in California. Rubio's failed to note that the fact that the company's largest costs appeared to be debt payments, which had exploded since its acquisition by a private equity firm in 2010. Additional opposition to the minimum wage increase picked up steam once the law went into effect. In June, the California Business and Industrial Alliance took out a full-page ad in USA Today declaring that the state's fast food businesses had dropped nearly 10,000 jobs in anticipation of the new law. Similar claims began appearing in conservative media, local newspapers, and the national business press, blaming the new minimum wage law for mass layoffs and restaurant closures. But that narrative, however, was based on a statistical fallacy. The 10,000 jobs lost number originated in an article from the Hoover Institution, a free market-oriented think tank which analyzed raw employment data from September 2023 through the end of the year. But as the anonymous blogger Invictus and the Los Angeles Times columnist Michael Hiltzik have pointed out, the fast food industry always sheds jobs during the fall and winter months, simply because people go out to eat less during those colder months. The industry then gains those jobs back during spring and summer when consumer demand historically recovers. According to seasonally adjusted employment numbers, which are widely considered more reliable because they account for these regular ups and downs, the California fast food industry actually gained more than 5,000 jobs during the period in question. And many factors could affect fast food employment in California, positively or negatively, that have nothing to do with the minimum wage. That's why in a recent paper, a pair of economists from Berkeley compared employment for California's fast food workers with that of similar workers in states that still abide by the $7.25 an hour federal minimum wage. These authors found that employment for the two groups was on roughly the same trajectory prior to the April wage increase, but that since then, California's fast food employment had actually grown slightly faster than these other states. Now, that doesn't mean that raising the minimum wage will have no negative consequences. Researchers also found that the higher minimum wage also caused menu prices in California fast food chains to rise by about 3.7%. But that number is far lower than the $20 Big Macs that critics of the law warned of. But it's still significant at a time when many consumers are deeply upset over the post-pandemic increase in food prices. But even so, this number pales in comparison with the 18% raise that the average fast food worker received because of the new law. The authors calculated that about 62% of the wage increase was absorbed through higher prices, while the rest was likely absorbed by a mix of reduced turnover and, importantly, lower profits for franchisees, hence the massive industry resistance. Despite the law's broadly positive real-world consequences, the nonstop negative press about it has turned it into a political liability. In November, California's voters narrowly rejected a ballot measure that would have raised the state's minimum wage for all industries to $18 an hour, following a massive industry-led campaign centered on the claim that the state's fast food minimum wage experiment had been a disaster. And the biggest losers from this misleading narrative won't be the Californians themselves. It will be the workers in the 20 other states that still have a minimum wage at or below the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. 19 of the 20 voted for Trump in 2024. California's government has made plenty of mistakes in recent years, but raising the minimum wage isn't one of them. If politicians in Washington are serious about delivering for the working class voters who bring them to power and who overwhelmingly support raising the minimum wage, they might consider following California's lead on this issue. We will continue to follow this and all the important topics and trends in the world of work here on the HR Happy Hour Media Network. That's it for the Workplace Minute, powered by H3 HR Advisors.